Well, thanks again for inviting me, Justin, and thank you everybody for showing up on my computer. And yes, it always is more fun when I get questions. This is my community, San Diego, so I know all the people that you saw on screen. So anything you want to know, I can amplify, and as well as the bigger picture, as Justin says. I'll start kind of at the end right now. I was mentioning earlier, we just got back from El Paso, and El Paso is sort of the other bookend. San Diego's one bookend in the West Coast, and El Paso is the other one for Frontier Jews, the series, which includes, the first one was Tijuana Jews. Although I did Tijuana Jews not thinking it's a series, I did it for two reasons. Tijuana Jews, Justin, I guess, programmed it. That was our last program in October. Tijuana Jews, as I mentioned before, grew out of a necessity to explain myself. I got tired of people asking me, how do an Artenstein come from Mexico? And I explained Jewish migration into Mexico, which is essentially derived from the fact that Ellis Island in 1924 closed up to Eastern European Jews and many other ethnicities because of the quotas, the 1924. So that's how my family ended up in Mexico and eventually in Tijuana. But Tijuana is part of a larger picture. And I use Frontier Jews with a very specific purpose or agenda, if you will. My inspiration really was, after Tijuana Jews, having met Harriet Rocklin, the author of the seminal book called Pioneer Jews. A great, great book, incredibly well illustrated. The photographs there are part of a huge archive that Harriet Rocklin and her husband, no longer with us, donated to the University of Arizona and UCLA. So Pioneer Jews is really the inspiration. I worked with Harriet before she passed away, you know, kind of discussing different regions, what segments, what episodes to shoot. And but I purposely didn't want to use the word pioneer. I used frontier because in Spanish, frontier, frontera, has the added meaning of literally meaning border. So these are border states, you know, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, because I had to limit it to some extent to the border, because in Harriet Rocklin's book, Pioneer Jews, it's the whole West, from Texas to California, up to Oregon and Alaska. Yes, there was Pioneer Jews in Alaska. So that scope, I could not really hope to do. I mean, I need like a 13-part series, because each state is very, very unique, and through the lens of the border region. Like I said, I just got back from El Paso, and it was just fascinating because each community is unique. I have to say, I always look, what's the most unique thing about that community that I'm documenting? And then, of course, while they are unique, there's also a lot of universality. I know that when you see my films, all of you hopefully saw a portrait of Jewish San Diego, and I'm sure you found a lot of commonality with our community. Where did your grandparents come from? How did they get to the West? You know, those stories are echoed in all of our communities. And then, are we different from other Jewish communities? I mean, are Jews from San Diego, El Paso, Houston, any different from New York Jews? Are they different from Chicago Jews, Los Angeles Jews, Israeli Jews, Argentinian Jews? I mean, those are real distinct Jewish communities. And almost like, I always think, you know, we always ask ourselves, well, what is a Jew? What is a Jew? I mean, I think they're still debating it in Israel for, if you want to make Aliyah, you know, it keeps on changing or modifying itself, or people question, what is a Jew? Well, it's more than just the matrilineal, you know, justification for being Jewish. We are kind of a mosaic of different ethnicities. You know, Ethiopian Jews, they seem just as observant as many other Jewish communities, but obviously they're their own unique ethnicity. So I bring it back to the Southwest, bring it back to unique communities that we are along the Southwest, along the border, with that caveat that there is a universality that we all connect with. All Jewish communities, no matter where they are, connect to some extent with what we're seeing here in the Southwest. One thing that I'll tell you right away that is very unique about the Southwest, we had in the Western states office holders a lot earlier than in the East Coast, where the more established, older Jewish communities were. Our ancestors were pioneers in this region. They could read, they could write, and they were needed to participate civically and be office holders. You have a lot of judges. I mean, you have Jewish sheriffs in the Old West. No kidding. But just chronologically, that's the characteristic about Jews in the West. There was more openness, if you will. A lot of things that I hear about too, like when I interview people in New Mexico, Santa Fe, El Paso, says the other factor was that, it was the desert. We had to stick together to survive. And also the Indian nations were not too happy with what's going on. Their land, their way of life was being challenged, and they in turn challenged the pioneers. So the takeaway from El Paso, and I'll bring it back to San Diego, is that I get the sense that everybody kind of echoes this, people learn to get along with each other. The largest mercantile enterprise there, the Popular Store, which lasted almost the entirety of the 20th century, the Schwartzes had it, family run, competed and rivaled the big department stores, the Macy's, the Broadways, all of them. But interesting stuff, they were the first to hire African Americans in Texas. It was a fully bilingual establishment because Juarez was across the border, and a large percentage of the business came from Juarez. So, the university was the first to integrate its sports teams and the college leagues and so on. So that's something that people in El Paso, the Jewish community, is very, very proud of. Now, just one last reflection on San Diego, the film that we're talking about today. Although Justin and I, since we finished, Cinewest finished shooting El Paso, I said, let's expand it now to the series. And pretty soon you're gonna get something in your email later in the year about the Zoom for El Paso Jews, which we're thinking of calling the People of the Crossing. Reflecting back on the border before I finished with San Diego, El Paso, it turns out, and I interviewed Richard Parker, who's a very good friend of the Jewish community. He happens not to be Jewish, he's Mexican and American. And again, a New York Times writer. And he says, I'm writing a book after the horrible massacre in El Paso that happened a couple of years ago. My editors at the New York Times offered that I should write a major book on El Paso. People, he says, still refer to it as a dusty town, but it's one of the major metropolises, in the Southwest for sure. And he says, it is the most important crossing in the American continent, north and south. Its geography, El Paso, the pass, the crossing, reflects that, that character since, Native American times. The Camino Real that came from Mexico City all the way up through El Paso and into the territory and into Santa Fe. He says it's just the most accessible and the most crossed border in the continent. In modernity, Tijuana, San Diego has bypassed in terms of numbers. We're just such a big border here in Tijuana. But in the old days, there was no way to get to Tijuana and San Diego to cross the border. The terrain did not allow it. So El Paso has that characteristic. Also, interestingly, east and west, the fastest way to connect the two coasts, east and west coast, is driving through El Paso on Interstate 10. And again, that gave the El Paso community a very unique characteristic. Many families, Jewish families that could not make it into the United States because of the quota system I mentioned before, we'll go to Mexico. Mexico did have a more open door policy towards immigrants at that time. And families would then try to cross into the United States, of course, through El Paso, to such a degree that the rabbi for the Reform Synagogue, Mount Sinai, Rabbi Zelenka, became a real figurehead in the early part of the 20th century in terms of helping Jewish refugees come in from Mexico into the US. There was a women's committee in El Paso, going back to the early 1900s in El Paso, that the women's committee most important task was to help refugees. That was, they opened up the first kindergarten in El Paso, a lot of things, but there's a rich archive of letters and documents of Jewish families in Mexico. Help, we have family in the United States, but we can't get visas. What can you do? So slowly but surely, the Women's Committee and Rabbi Zelenka through B'nai B'rith became very, very active in helping refugees. And it's something that El Paso is very proud of because, this whole Central American refugee impacted the border of El Paso incredibly. And of course, it became very politicized, and the Jewish community was very involved in helping refugees. As somewhere in the Bible says, for we were once strangers in a strange land. It was very moving, really emotional for me to hear members of the Jewish community in El Paso take on that philosophy, that mitzvah, if you will. Tijuana, San Diego is a very different border in terms of, well, obviously geographic situation, but in terms of its historical development in general and in specific, the Jewish community. The first Jews that we have a record of arriving in San Diego, and hence the name, the title for the documentary, To the Ends of the Earth. It was really hard to get to San Diego from the East Coast, but with the gold rush, San Diego really was the entry point. If you were coming by ship, that was the first port that you would arrive if you were coming through the Pacific, which was a real ordeal, because once you left the East Coast, you had to either go way, way down to the Strait of Magellan, the tip of South America, come around the strait, and then go up to Chile. And that's as far as, ships would go. Then from Chile, hope to get a boat from Valparaiso to San Diego. And you finally arrived. Or the other option, prior to the Panama Canal, you would get off in Nicaragua or Panama and try to make your way across the Darien Strait, which was basically malaria central. And then once you made it across to the Pacific side, again, you hope to embark on a ship to get to San Diego. So San Diego was very, very hard to come to. Also, immigrants to Tijuana, Jewish Mexican immigrants, like my family, my mom and my grandma talk about the fact my grandparents came in through Veracruz in the 20s. And then as Tijuana, with World War II, became a boom town, the population exploded. There was, sailors on leave. There was just a lot of economic movement, a lot of tourism in Tijuana. And of course, with its reputation as a border sin city, it only helped business, if you know what I mean. But there was just a lot of potential, a lot of opportunity for businesses set up, and Jewish families like my own settled in Tijuana. But she says at that time, in the early 40s, when the family decided to go to Tijuana, because so it turned out my mom's grandparents had come ahead of the family, and they said, you have to come to Tijuana. And they did, he says, but there was no way of getting directly to Tijuana. They came up from Chihuahua, El Paso, and then they had to travel on the American side. And then finally, they made it to Tijuana. So the border, it was a more remote border. It was the ends of the earth at that time. So Tijuana, San Diego had a very different development to now, where I think the Tijuana, San Diego border, I think it's the busiest border crossing in the planet. More people, more goods go across that border than anywhere else in the world. And I must say that also impacts on the Jewish community, on all communities. For instance, when my family moved from Tijuana to San Diego, my parents wanted us to go to American schools and, you know, take advantage of the fact that, you know, this whole idea, we have the best of both worlds here at the border. So we moved across the border, but my dad still commuted every day to Tijuana to the curio shop that he had there on the main street, Revolution Street. If anybody has visited Tijuana, that's the main street where all the curio shops were, and it led straight to the racetrack and the wonderful casino, the much heralded casino of the 1920s, which was owned by Mexican politicians and Hollywood moguls. And that casino is where a young dancer by the name of Margarita Cancino got her start, was discovered, taken to Hollywood, and she became Rita Hayworth. So this border has a lot of, it's a very legendary border, for the better or the worse. Again, my family, my younger brother, commutes every day to his business in Tijuana. He has a distributorship of American goods into Mexico, and he has to take care of business on both sides of the border. So despite this whole craziness that the war on drugs created with the increase of violence and all this stuff, the relationship at the border between the US and Mexico is very dynamic, very productive. It's just, you know, two major, you know, countries come together there, and there's, you know, people have family members on both sides of the border. So that's what kind of defines San Diego. Another thing that I mentioned in the documentary, if you remember, Zollman, Dr. Zollman, she was the curator of the exhibit at the History Center that I interviewed. Parallel to the documentary they saw, Portrait of Jewish San Diego, there was a major exhibit at the History Center, the main history museum at our Balboa Park, about the Jewish community. She mentioned something that's fascinating. San Diego, percentage-wise, has the largest number of non-US born Jewish people in its community. Between the Mexican Jews, the Russian Jews, the Israeli Jews, the South African Jews, we make up 20% of the Jewish community here in San Diego. Even though by far San Diego is not the largest Jewish community, but percentage-wise, foreign-born Jews make up 20% of our community. And that adds a real interesting dynamic to, I mean, it's not uncommon. We just had a wedding postponed. My nephew, who's, you know, family's from Mexico, of course, is marrying a young woman from whose family's from South Africa, you know, and that gives San Diego kind of a nice, rich flavor that we all like, added to, of course, the border location that we have. Anyways, I could keep on going, but if there's any questions, comments, regrets.
No, I want to kind of advance you're talking about, you know, your family going from Tijuana, I think it's Tijuana, to San Diego. And so a couple questions related to that. In Tijuana Jews, and also in this film, we learn of a place called Ken, which is a you know, place where Jews, I guess Latin American Jews, Hispanic Jews gather, kind of keep their culture. So question number one for me is, were you growing up, did you go to Ken? And number two is, can you talk about your family's Jewish upbringing? Where'd you go to synagogue, etc., in San Diego?
Sure. Well, the Ken actually started in Tijuana, and we talk about it in Tijuana Jews. My Hebrew teacher, Mrs. Galikot, her maiden name was Levine, but married a Galikot from Tijuana. She came from Mexico City. She was a real youth organizer in Mexico City, which has a community of about 50,000 Jews, unlike Tijuana, which at that time had 500-600 in its community. So along with starting the first Hebrew classes, Sunday school, if you will, Mrs. Galikot also, with a group of other parents, started the Ken. The Ken means the nest. Of course, it means yes in Hebrew, but I learned that it means the nest. And at the very beginning in Tijuana, I participated. And then as I grew older, I went to college in Los Angeles, but my younger siblings at first would go from San Diego to Tijuana to participate at the Ken. They had, you know, summer camp, the whole nine thing. The Ken is pretty much a youth movement. So then when the organizers of the Ken in Tijuana realized that most of the families were coming to the United States, they were moving with their kids, obviously, they decided to open up on the American side, and it just blossomed. It blossomed because it was an idea that people really embraced. They liked the idea of keeping the Jewish Latin American flavor tradition. Plus, you know how it is. People know each other in the community. They want to stick together. And the Ken, even though it moved to the States, all of its activities were conducted in Spanish. Another characteristic of the Ken, and I think it's the influence of Mexico City Jews who moved in big numbers to the States, to San Diego, after all the political problems and devaluations in Mexico. A lot of Mexican Jews from Mexico City moved to San Diego, and they really reinforced the numbers of the Ken. It kept on growing and growing. There was a founding of a very large day school, San Diego Jewish Academy, and the Ken is now housed out of the Jewish Academy. It's like the Jewish Academy, K through 12, is like a university campus here in San Diego. And a lot of Jewish families that are thinking about moving from where they are, they always rank the ability to send their kids to a Jewish academy as a very attractive aspect of San Diego. So that's the Ken. It's grown, it's flourishing. It, you know, all my nephews and nieces are graduates of the Ken. They become counselors. And also, I have to say, and I think it's the Mexico City influence, there's also a very Zionistic credo belief where they also participate very actively with, you know, the heritage trips to Israel. And pretty much if you're a counselor, you're expected to go to Israel. So it has that interesting dynamic too. Now, my own Jewish upbringing, when I started in Tijuana Jews, we talked about around the 1940s, the first Jewish congregation started, Magen David, which was mostly Sephardic. Then as more Ashkenazi Jews came to town, the Hatikva started, which was the Ashkenazi congregation. And there was always differences and, you know, rivalries, what have you. But by the time I was ready to go to, you know, Sunday school, Hebrew school, which I guess was Wednesdays, the two communities, Magen David Sephardic and Hatikva Ashkenazi had merged. So I took my first Hebrew classes with the woman that I mentioned, Mrs. Galikot. And, but prior to that, I remember now, prior to Mrs. Galikot coming to Tijuana, we had to have a rabbi from San Diego come across the border to teach us Hebrew and religion. And then for my bar mitzvah, the JCC had just been built, and there's footage of my bar mitzvah in Tijuana Jews. We had to have a rabbi, the conservative rabbi, Rabbi Levins, come from Tifereth Israel in San Diego to officiate at my bar mitzvah. Now it's become Chabad. The JCC and the congregation there is run by Chabad. I think it's the only Chabad with an Olympic-sized pool and steam bath, tennis courts, you name it. And when I was starting to study for my bar mitzvah, I lived in Chula Vista, San Diego County, but my bar mitzvah was going to be at the JCC in Tijuana. That was the congregation. So I'm describing a very cross-border Jewish upbringing. I could have had the bar mitzvah in San Diego at Tifereth Israel like my cousins, but we brought the rabbi from Tifereth Israel to the JCC because that's where we could have, you know, the ceremony and the big party. That a wonderful events hall. And I remember at that time, we had a cantor Henry Bornstein, come from LA to San Diego to teach me my Haftorah and the prayers. And I was really impressed. I mean, this is back in the 60s. He left behind a record, an LP record with my Haftorah that I could practice to on a record player. That was technologically very revolutionary at that time. You know, I guess you just get your Haftorah online and you rock on with your bar mitzvah instruction. After that, you know, after that Jewish upbringing, it's, you know, the life of a secular Jew, you know. It's, you know, the occasional Shabbat at mom's. Passover, I love, and my family celebrates it. And I don't belong to a congregation right now. My congregation is my editing room. That's where I commune with my fellow Jews. I talk to rabbis. I focus on Judaism and the meaning of Judaism, and ask the, you know, the questions to higher themes.
And in your editing room, especially with the, you know, the Long Journey film, you know, there's you talked about converso Jews, right?
Mm-hmm.
But this comes from Elaine. Is there a history of converso Jews in San Diego?
Very spotty, not as organized as a congregation, as a community as it happened in El Paso. In Tijuana, there's a rabbi that converted, although he doesn't, I don't think he claims to have Spanish, Sephardic, Anusim, converso roots. He followed an interesting path that many Catholics follow, not many, but some Catholics follow in Mexico. Disenchanted with the Catholic Church, they turned to Christian or Protestant congregations, and somehow that connects them to a world outside the all, you know, powerful Catholic Church, and they connect with Judaism. In that some of these, you know, you get these Christian communities that embrace Israel, embrace Judaism, even though Jesus is their savior in their ritual and their beliefs. There's, through Protestant denominations, there is an approximation to Judaism. And this rabbi converted from Catholicism to Protestantism and then went to a Jewish university, I think in Los Angeles, and became a fully ordained rabbi. He has a congregation in Tijuana. separate from the one that I went to. There has been some efforts to maybe merge, but in Mexico, I have to say, not San Diego, it's difficult for the mainstream Jewish congregations to accept people that want to convert to Judaism. It's really, really hard. Mexican Jewish communities are very conservative in terms of conversions. It can be done. So those people that feel they may be conversos, they do their genealogical research. In this border, it's not as big a phenomenon as it is in El Paso, Texas, which, as you may know from a long journey, Rabbi Leon, the Rabbi Emeritus for B'nai Zion, the conservative congregation, has done real pioneering work. One, in terms of opening up a conservative synagogue to those wishing to return to Judaism, and two, actually crossing into Juarez, across the border, to officiate, teach, and help convert people in Juarez that may not have a visa to come across and take classes with him. And of course, now with the pandemic, he's conducted high holiday services online. And of course, that becomes very accessible to people across the border. And if you saw a long journey, there's members of the community of El Paso that work with him translating simultaneously. So there's a really active dynamic in terms of converso Jews at that border, but not in San Diego, Tijuana, except for this congregation. But some of those members in Tijuana on the Mexican side claim that they have Jewish roots and they're coming back with this rabbi, with this congregation. And in San Diego, you'll find people that are doing genealogical research that tell me, yes, I found out that I have Sephardic roots. My family goes back to Spain and blah, blah, blah. But there's not so much as an organized converso community, if you will.
In the film, I thought one of the unique, probably in the first 10, 12 minutes, was when we hear from the young woman who you had a diary of the young woman, Victoria Jacobs.
Oh, yeah.
And so, it was really unique to kind of hear about, she was cleaning for Sabbath and she was getting ready for Yom Kippur. And you guys kind of recreated that by putting her, we met an actress and she was in period dress and using a quill pen. When you knew that journal was there, what was going through your mind about the best way visually to present it? Obviously, I think you did a great job, but what are ways that, I guess, are you happy with the way it came to life? I'm sure you are.
Yeah, but, very much so. Yeah. Well, I have a background in directing actors. I've done independent feature films, and this magical little diary turned up of a young woman, a teenager, really 17 years old, who was about to be married, and she lived in Old Town. This is the 1850s. And her fiance, as a present, gave her a diary. So she started keeping a diary from the moment they were engaged and their first years of marriage. And it's a precious, precious document. Victoria Jacobs is the name of the young woman. And her background is also fascinating. She was from a Polish Jewish family that left Poland in the 1800s, ended up in London, and from London came to San Diego. So I said, wow, this is really an Eastern European Jew. Very rare, because if you know your Jewish history, the first Jewish immigrants into the States in the 19th century were German Jews. They were in New York, everywhere else before any other Jewish immigrants arrived. So I thought it was really unique. And like you said, Justin, she would record everyday things, tomorrow's Yom Kippur. I spent the whole day helping to clean the house, kind of complaining. She takes it like she's having to do chores. Then as she becomes engaged, she writes about the fact that the steamer came down from San Francisco with her engagement ring, and she was getting ready to get on a wagon with her fiance and the rest of the community to welcome the ship and get the goods. To have the perspective of a young Jewish woman of what was really kind of an Old West, very much an Old West town, was fascinating. So with my executive producer, Bill Lawrence, who's the director of the museum, we brainstormed, and I said, how do we do this? And there was an actress that, as it turned out, her family were kind of pioneers in Old Town, a Jewish family. And she totally connected with the material. And if you go to Old Town, those of you that have visited Old Town, or if you ever will, you find that it's very preserved. There's a lot of old homes, buildings, hotels are turned into restaurants now from the 1800s. So we went to one of the pioneer houses, Casa Bandini, and they let us shoot there. And we basically recreated a 19th century home with a young girl writing her diary. And the technique was that she, of course, would read out loud as she's writing. And I had a great team. My wife's a producer, so she got wardrobe, makeup, art direction. It was a little mini movie that we did. It was a really fun thing to do for a documentary, which kind of all of a sudden became kind of a hybrid, with dramatized scenes. So everybody really responded to that. And let me add something to it. We did capsules, short 3 to 5 minute capsules for the exhibit. So when you went to see the diary, they actually displayed this diary, what, 1850s, that's, over 150 years? I can't do the math right now. So 170, whatever. They had the diary open there, and we had a monitor with somebody representing the character of Victoria Jacobs reading from that diary. As we had other monitors, there were part of the interviews that I did for Portrait of Jewish San Diego, but extracts. There was a section with the Jewish pioneers, and then the Jewish innovators. San Diego, I mean, it's amazing. 2 top technical innovators are here, Erwin Jacobs and Andrew Vitruvi. They founded Linkabit and Qualcomm, basically Vitruvi, I think, was one of the key people in developing cellular telephones and technology. These are they're very, very pioneering in communications, but they're the new presence. Dr. Jonas Salk, who invented the polio vaccine, also settled in San Diego. So that was, another video capsule from content, from material that we shot for the longer documentary that you saw.
And 2 things that connected to that, I read recently that, are you engaged with the museum again about like completing work on the history exhibit or something? Is that right?
No, what we're doing now, it's also a historical project. You see, when I do these documentaries, whether it's El Paso, New Mexico, Tijuana, San Diego, I interview like an average of 50 people. I end up with 40 to 50 hours of interview material. First, the main and most pressing challenge is to turn it into an hour documentary, from 40 to 1. That's the ratio. And there's a lot of valuable testimonials in those 40 hours. What do you do with them? Well, we have some funding, and we're looking for funding still to create an archive. Right now, we're focusing on Tijuana and Portrait of Jewish San Diego, because obviously the museum has a special interest in that archive. So we are in the process of editing all the interviews for both projects, so they flow without my interruptions or stops and starts. They flow like a videographed oral history would. And we take out the stops and the starts and the stumbles and my interruptions as a director when I'm giving direction. And we transcribe them so present and future generations will have access, whether it's researchers or family members. Imagine, if you grew up in Houston, your family's from Houston several generations back, and we interviewed your grandparents. Well, in San Diego, that's happened with my grandparents, our community's grandparents, or a sampling of them, and other generations. And now they're there, you know, and with the incredible technologies that are, you know, working miracles online, those interviews can be posted online. So you and your kids can access them from your home. And a lot of the haul from documentary filmmaking is also historical photos. So that becomes part of the archive. So that's kind of the continuation, if you will, Justin, of the project, and in partnership with the museum.
Right. And oh yeah, so filmmaking is obviously a very collaborative project. You know, a lot of people involved, right? You just mentioned wardrobe for that, you know, and makeup, and there's audio. Can you talk about your relationship, collaboration with the director of photography at your films, and how important that you share a vision, and what that relationship is like on set?
Well, since my documentaries are very interview driven, you know, when the person sits down to be interviewed and I'm working with Sergio, I tell him, Sergio, make my Jews look good. Stories, they got up the yin yang. Well, you know, we establish a certain aesthetic, you know, and I try to conduct interviews in a very intimate way, in that the audience feels that they're part of the conversation. And there's techniques that you have for that. Obviously, you want to have a very pleasant frame, the background that's kind of representative of that person, you know, that person's library, their home, their study, their living room. We always try to do that. So right from the get-go, the look of the documentary is the first conversation that I have with my director of photography. I've had the fortune of working with the same director of photography for the last 4 episodes and other projects. So we have a lot of shorthand. So that's a key conversation that we have. The other one is based on what we call the B-roll. You just don't want to have talking heads. As good as we make everybody look, you gotta sort of illustrate those interviews with imagery. And of course, the obvious imagery is old photographs, old footage of what people in the community are talking about in the interview. But also there's a dynamic that I really try to apply, and having a drone has made it really, really accessible, where we shoot, you know, drone imagery, which enables you to illustrate the cultural landscapes and the natural landscapes. Obviously, with the Southwest, with San Diego, the landscape is such an integral part of the story that that's how we incorporate it. But then there's the cultural landscapes, you know, the synagogues, the urban setting of the community and all that. So that's another conversation I have with my director with photography, along with what's become a integral part of every film crew, your drone operator. And drones are no longer just for shooting aerial shots, bird's eye shots. They're a very dynamic instrument with incredibly sharp lenses and optics in general. I mean, we were down in Baja California tracing the Camino Real, you know, the road of the Californias, the King's Road, and working with this pioneering, it's a portrait of a pioneering photographer that went to Baja California before the Trans-Peninsular Highway. And one of his first books is tracing how the Spanish colonialists came up Baja California from south to north for the founding of San Diego and Monterey, the capital of California. So we found, you know, remnants of the Camino Real, and we had this drone at eye level kind of cruising the Camino as he's talking, describing how the Camino Real looked in the old days. So that has been a 3-way conversation now. director, director of photography, drone operator. That's really important. And for that specific scene that you referenced, Justin, the recreation of this historical dramatization, writing and reading from the diary, it's all about creating the mood of what we interpret artistically the lighting would be at night in a 19th century home in San Diego. And what you do with that is lighting is very, very important. It's key to cinematography because it creates the mood. You know, it creates the ambiance. It creates the, you know, the world that the characters will inhabit. So the first rule of lighting is you establish a source. You have to ask yourself, how is this room being lit? Okay, there's a small kerosene lamp. Well, you put a small kerosene lamp, and then of course, that kerosene lamp is not going to light the room. So you get an artificial light outside the frame to make it seem like the light is coming from the direction of the kerosene lamp. And there you see a window in the back, and you do see it in the scene. And well, there's a lamppost. We invented it. There's no lamppost there, but we want to have the feeling of a lamppost outside. So we park a light outside of the building coming through the window. So that's another key conversation with the director of photography and the director to create the look.
Yeah, the look was great. The aerials, the landscapes were really magnificent. Go ahead, Jen.
Well, I just wondered if they ever changed that 1/4 mile road that they made you go around for that synagogue in the movie.
No, you still have to go. I'm sorry, what was your name again?
My Jan Rose.
Yeah, what Jan Rose is referencing is the fact that when the Jewish community needed to expand, and the logical place to expand to was La Jolla, then a restricted community, there was huge battles to get a permit to build a synagogue. So it was also a battle that had to do with the University of California, San Diego. The chancellor saying to the realtors in La Jolla, listen, do you want to keep the Jews out or do you want a university? Take your pick. You can't have both. Because a lot of my professors are going to be Jewish, and I'm going to have them work in La Jolla and have to leave town after they finish teaching to go back to their homes. So there was some very anti-Semitic types. I don't know if it was in the city council or some board. And when they finally had to relent, because it was illegal to keep a synagogue from it being established there, the rabbi recalls on camera that they were going to have they were not going to let them go directly from the highway into the synagogue. You have to shoot past it, I forget how many feet, and they make a U-turn. So it's something that everybody, when they go to shul, somehow either remembers or is impacted by that decision.
And going back to
it's not so bad though, because on the right hand side they put a Whole Foods so you can go and shop and then go to synagogue afterwards. So it's not so bad anymore.
Make the best of it.
you
Thanks for asking that question. That part of the movie was very interesting to me. All of that. Thanks.
Sure.
connected to it. Is there have any other places you've done films on or had anti-Semitism type challenges like San Diego or anything like it that you've, like New Mexico, or I don't think so, right? Or
excuse me, that's my editor. I'll just have to call him later. We're working remotely now.
okay.
So no, I didn't encounter it. Well, I have to say that for the most part, most communities in the Southwest have said what I echoed before, that there was a
Hi, baby.
kind of a sense of people coming together. They just didn't feel the anti-Semitism, not in New Mexico, not in El Paso. And in Arizona, I talked to people, they did feel that anti-Semitism started in the 1880s, late 1800s, when the railroad came and a large influx of Anglos came in, and maybe not specifically anti-Semitic, but certainly anti-Mexican attitudes. And for the most part, it was for instance, Tucson was a very Mexican town with a sprinkling of a Jewish community and other, certainly Native American. So there was, when we did interviews in Tucson, stories of having restricted, community clubs. You couldn't go, if you were Jewish, to certain dances at the club or at all. And also, there's a really wonderful hotel, if I am not mistaken, it's called La Posada, a very historical hotel. And the ladies of the B'nai B'rith were having Mrs. Roosevelt back in the 40s come and visit them. She was good friends with the owner of La Posada. Then the ladies of the B'nai B'rith informed Mrs. Roosevelt that La Posada was a restricted hotel. You couldn't stay there if you were Jewish. She immediately canceled her reservations there, even though it was her friend's hotel, and stayed somewhere else. So there, in Arizona, there were instances of anti-Semitism, mostly in the form of restricted neighborhoods, restricted, community clubs.
All right, here's my last question. So I know if anyone else has any questions, please put them in the chat. But let's go back to El Paso, since that's really a fresh experience. And I'm curious, when you went there, I guess how many days were you there? And was it pretty much the agenda was interviews and B-roll? Give us a sense of kind of that experience when you were in El Paso shooting for that one.
We did a lot of prep. I was able to hook up with people in the community there. And one of them, her name is Romy Hebert. Her family was a pioneering family that came to El Paso back in the late 1800s. And she had also done television work. She knows the community. So I did a lot of pre-interviews, if you will, with folks. Then by the time we were ready to shoot, we had lined up about 20, 25 people to interview. And it took about a couple of weeks to do that. And there were some special moments too, besides the interviews. We were doing some scouting. The first day we got there was a Monday. We decided not to shoot. Let's just go scout the different locations. Let's go to the different temples and get a feel for it. That way, when we show up the next day, we know what lights to bring. And my cameraman said, let me bring the camera just in case. And I said, I really don't want to set up their equipment. I said, well, I'll just grab it. And sure enough, we get to Mount Sinai. They said, listen, make yourselves at home. You can go in any room you want, look around, except there's a Torah scribe in the library. And I go, wow. I mean, my filmmaker instincts just lit up, And I said, can I say hello? No, he's very busy. He has to leave for Baltimore. He's catching up because of COVID. He couldn't come and blah, blah. Can I just say hello? I've never met a Torah scribe. She says, okay, fine. So I opened the door to the library, and the congregation's 4 Torahs are fully spread out. And this guy was really illuminated. He was just an incredibly spiritual, I guess old Torah scribes have that because they read Torah all day long. But really a unique human being. And before we knew it, Sergio brought the camera. We were interviewing him on the meaning of being a Torah scribe. And then something fascinating happened within those 2 weeks. As we're shooting there in the library, he says, by the way, something really unique. I found a typo in one of the Torahs. And I go, what do you mean? He says, yeah, there's two words where there should be a third one in the middle. And I go, what do you do? And he demonstrated, he says, you scratch the two words and then you put the three words smaller so they fit in the two word space. And he already had done it, but he had, recorded it with his camera, and so it was a wonderful, magical scene. He says, you can scrape off any letter to do corrections except for the word of God. If there's, there better not be a typo next to the word of God, because you cannot scratch it out. So it was a nice little magical scene. My family had a store in Juarez across the border from El Paso. So we went across the border, and with one of my aunts, we located where the old store was back in the 50s. Then we went to my grandmother's grave at the Congregation Cemetery, B'nai Zion. And Rabbi Leon, who's from that congregation where my grandmother used to go, used to come across the border from Juarez to El Paso for services. And my aunt that was with me had gotten married at B'nai Zion. So the rabbi from B'nai Zion, Rabbi Leon, who I feature in A Long Journey, he actually came to my grandmother's gravesite and sang and did the Kaddish, and we recorded. It was a beautiful, unexpected scene. And I was so pleased to see that my family had put an Artenstein headstone along with, the headstone of my grandmother. So it allowed me to weave my family story into that episode. So again, with the interviews and all these things going across the border and all that other stuff, and they had a really interesting thing. Because of COVID, practically once a month, I think, the B'nai Zion, the conservative congregation, would cook Shabbat dinners for the whole community, and you can just drive up and pick them up. And then they would do a Zoom Shabbat Zoom with your meal, and Rabbi Leon would officiate, but also they would have different Jewish community themes. There was a Persian Jewish menu one of the occasions, and there was more of an Eastern European menu with, of course, the brisket. And then that day that I was there, by total coincidence, hey, do you want to shoot today's menu? They're prepping it in the kitchen. I go, what's the menu? It's Sephardi. I'm going to have to take this just 2 seconds, okay? I'm just going to let him know. Philippe, you need the attachment? I'm finishing up a Zoom with Houston. I'll be sending it real soon. Sorry. He needs to finish the credits for the new documentary on Baja. Anyways, and we're facing a deadline. So that's post-production for you. So where was I? I was talking about the whole El Paso experience and the production, how long it took. And now we are finishing this Baja California documentary. We have transcribed 25 hours of interviews from El Paso. And with these transcriptions that your editing machine now generates, which makes life a lot easier, we kind of start selecting statements, from each interviewee. So we kind of start building the first cut literally on paper, or on PDF, I should say. And then once I finish making my selects from each interview, my editor will put them together into the first cut. So we've transitioned from a conversation about production into post-production. Then from the first cut, we fine-tune it only using interviews. We jokingly call it in post-production a radio cut, because you can close your eyes and it's like a radio show. You just hear voices talking. And then that's what we call, besides the radio cut is made up of A-roll. A-roll is your interview. And I think we've talked about this before. B-roll is what you illustrated with. B-roll, once you have your radio cut, once you have your first cut with interviews, you start illustrating them with B-roll, the photos, the stock footage, the home movies, the drone shots. And that's the next phase. From the from the radio cut to the first cut, and then you just keep on refining it. And then you get to a certain point where you ask yourself, is there anything else that we need to shoot? You know, take a real hard look. We've taken out everything that we can't fit, but is there certain pieces of content, whether it's interview or whether it's B-roll, that we need? And I always reserve a little bit of a budget. So when I finish my cut, my first cut, I can always go back and do what we do, pickup shots or second unit shots.
And not to put any pressure on you, or your editor, but you know, when can we expect the final cut of
I'm looking at our first cut at the end of this month, and a lot of it will be contingent on fundraising, because now I raised enough money to shoot the film. Now I need money to finish the film. It'll take me through the first cut. So if everything goes well and the money's in the bank, I could probably have something for you in April.
Okay, all right.
So build in a little bit of fundraising in between, and it becomes a big question mark.
Cool. No, well, thanks. Really, Isaac, thanks so much. This is the 4th time we've had Isaac for 4 different films. They've been fantastic. And I'm sure all of us here look forward to the next one, perhaps late in the spring sometime.